cherries are almost ready. You can see big clusters. Then this one is easily 50 years old. I mean, it's just incredible. What's going on, beautiful subscribers? It's May 29th here, southeastern Pennsylvania, and we're up the street at a local park checking out some giant old fruit trees. Check out the size of this European pear tree. This tree is easily 50 years old and 40 feet high. And this tree will produce an insane amount of pears every single year. This is what happens if you buy a standard fruit tree at the nursery instead of a dwarf or semi-dwarf. Look at the size of this. Just awesome. The pears are starting to put on serious size. You could see they're absolutely loaded. And this tree has not been thinned and has not been sprayed and is doing really well. European pears can get 50 to 75 years old. In some certain situations, they can get as old as 100 years. So, this is what happens if you get a standard pear tree and you give it plenty of time. Look at this canopy. This European pear tree, judging by the size of the trunk, is about 10 years old. So you can see the diameter of this trunk. If I had to guess, it was 10 years old. And then you look at the diameter of the trunks on the other two trees, which is like the size of a hula hoop, and they're easily pushing 50 years old, if not older. Here's an apple tree, easily 50 years old. I mean, look at the size of the trunk on this. I can't even wrap my arms around it. I mean, this thing is enormous. Apples are like the same as European pears. They can grow 50 to 75 years old. In some certain conditions, they can get as 100 years old. This tree is completely covered in fruit. And you can see that it's been pruned in the past. Like someone went in there and made a bunch of cuts and it exploded with new growth. But in general, there's very minimal maintenance being done on these trees in this park. Here's a close-up of some of the apples on this giant tree. I mean, it's already self-thinned, but look how much fruit is on this. We're only looking at 1% of the tree right now. I mean, the sheer amount of food that this one tree can create is just nuts. You see these holes on the tree here? These are from sap-sucking birds trying to pierce the tree to get the sap and nutrients out. Now, if they're in a straight line like this, it's from a bird. But if it's real random on your tree, it's from a boar. If you have real random holes and you think it's a boar, then we definitely need to treat it with some type of insecticide. If it's sap suckers, birds, then there's not much you're going to be able to do about it. This tree is so old, and the sapsuckers continually attack it, and the tree's doing fine. I have apple trees on my farm that have diameter trunks about this big, and they are 15 years old. So if I had to guess, I would say this apple tree is 15 years old. If the last tree was 15 years old, which I'm just guessing, judging off the ones I have at my farm, then this one is easily 25 years old. Look how much fruit is on this one apple tree. They will have to self-thin significantly more, or this entire branch is gonna break. I don't think these apples are for people. I mean, maybe some employees at the park harvest some, but mostly it's for wildlife. So they don't do a lot of spraying. There's lots of plum curculio damage, which I'll show you in a second. But the sheer amount of fruit on these trees is mind-blowing. I don't recommend you buy standard size fruit trees because you can see how enormous they get. This is a semi-dwarf size. This is about how big a semi-dwarf apple tree will get. It's much easier to maintain, easier to pick, easier to spray, easier to prune. So when you go to the nursery to buy a tree, most of them these days, 90% of them are grafted semi-dwarf to keep the trees small. A dwarf apple tree will stay even smaller. This is about what a full-size dwarf apple tree would look like. And if you have a small backyard orchard, then you probably want to buy dwarf apple trees. Now, they don't live nearly as long, or the internet claims, I don't know this from my experience, but because of the rootstock and because of the graft, they are more susceptible to diseases and different stresses. So, the giant standard apples we looked at earlier, they will live much longer, but way harder to maintain. The dwarf apple has a much lower life expectancy. Unfortunately, most of these trees have crazy amount of plum curculio damage. Some trees, though, don't have any damage at all. It's like the weevil only preferred certain apple trees over other apple trees. So if you guys have any experience with this, that would be really good to know. You can see it pierces a half moon crescent shape into the apple and lays an egg, and there'll be a worm in this, and no human is going to want to eat it. It'll still be fine for the deer and whatnot, but this is why you need to have some sort of insecticide program here in Zone 7A, Pennsylvania. Almost every apple on this tree is gonna have a worm in it. Look at this tree. It is filled with disease and insects, carpenter ants. The whole trunk is rotted 75% of the way around, and it is loaded with fruit. Once the insects get inside your tree from maybe a wound or an area of weakness, then the birds will get inside the tree to try and get the insects out. You can see this is woodpeckers and birds getting in there to eat all sorts of insects. It's cool to see the park is replanting new ones. You can see this old one didn't make it, and they have planted a new one. This is an Empire. Here's a cool apple tree that they keep taking the head out of for some reason. Maybe it broke or was damaged, but it has this donut shape now. This is probably what you guys want to look for in your backyard orchard. Keep the tree small for maintenance, and then get a lot of lower branches that you can easily pick from. Looks like they've replaced another one here. This is the Crimson Crisp. This apple's awesome. A lot like a Honey Crisp. But this tree has probably been in the ground for 3 years. Most of the time you buy a 6-footer at the nursery, and then it doesn't grow for the first year, and then it hardly does anything the second year, and then the third year it puts on a bunch of new growth. Here's what tent caterpillar looks like. This is a native cherry tree. If you see this in your fruit tree, this is a problem. You can cut the entire nest out if you want and discard it off your property, but I would also implement some sort of spray program. Check out this old gnarly apple tree. It's got a million problems: dead branches, disease, insects, bird damage, and it's still producing. You see the size of this giant cut that they made? You never want to get to this point in your tree. So if you can continually prune small branches and train small branches over time, and you never have to get to the point of making these huge cuts, it's much better, because these huge cuts never do well. And as you can see, it tore all the way back to the trunk. I want to show you guys what will happen if you prune too much in 1 year. So you could see all this crazy vertical growth on the entire tree, and that's because somebody came in here and topped it really hard and made a bunch of giant cuts. And what that does is it causes the tree to put on vigorous amount of growth, and all these shoots coming up are now a problem. It's hard to see, but there's a lot of vertical growth here. Straight up water sprouts. You see that? Someone came in and made big cuts, and they did too much, and the tree always sends up these water shoots, and then it becomes a long battle. Here's another European pear. Tons of vertical growth, water sprouts. This happens when you make big cuts or too many big cuts at one time. So if this was my tree, you'd have to come in here and take out 95% of these water sprouts. I mean, we want airflow in here. All this should come out. Don't be upset if you come outside this time of year and there's lots of fruit on the ground. This is normal. A tree is self-thinning. Here's a close-up of some more pears from a different European pear tree. And actually, there's way less plum curculio damage on these pears than the apples. Hopefully this is what your pears look like right now. Just incredible. This is a great example of an open center or vase pruning on an apple. Look, they took all the branches out of the middle, and now it's getting tons of sunlight, tons of airflow, and they left all the branches around the perimeter for picking. Here's what fire blight looks like. You can see the shepherd's hook at the top. You can see the bark is starting to shrivel up. This is a bad, bad sign for this apple tree. It's got a good amount of it all along this side. Look at the size of this sweet cherry. It's gotta be at least 25 years old. Most sweet cherries only supposed to live 20 to 40 years before they die of some sort of problem. And pie cherries have an even shorter life expectancy than that, 15 to 20 years. This is actually a tree that we pruned a few months ago. Let's zoom in and see if there's some fruit. Check it out. Look at all the cherries on this tree. Loaded. They're almost ready to be picked. There's a couple that are red. Maybe we can try one. But this is just one section of this tree. Actually, I think some of them are ready. I don't know what type of cherry they are because this is not my farm, but I mean, that was really good. It's a little sour, but the hard thing about cherries is getting them before all the birds do. So you might have to pick them a little earlier than you want. You're never going to net a tree this big. It's just giant. So you could hang little streamers in it. Anything you can do to keep the birds off. If that last cherry is 25 years old, judging the diameter, then this one's probably 15 years old. And it's holding a good amount of fruit too. I wonder if these are the white gold cherries that do really well here in southeastern Pennsylvania. I mean, look, no disease, no insect. They don't spray here. I mean, I would love to know what type of cherry this tree is because it's doing awesome. I think if you got one of your cherries to live to this age, you would only need one of them. Because it's just an incredible amount of fruit on one of these trees. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this video. Long story short, don't plant standard size fruit trees. These get way too big to maintain, but boy, are they cool. I'm gonna keep eating some cherries, and like always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.